have this webinar to discuss these two systems that aren't super well known. Bethany was actually my first person to ever talk to me about these two systems. So I'm also here to learn with everyone who tuned in. I'm going to start by passing the time over to Dr. Aldosari, who will be discussing the male guardianship system and how it impacts women in Saudi Arabia. After about 20 minutes or so, we'll pass it on to Bethany, who will discuss how the system impacts people from outside Saudi Arabia and how it impacts children that may have dual citizenship. And after that, we'll take time to answer a few questions from the people tuning in. I will say that when it comes to questions, Bethany's personal case is still ongoing. So let's just be all mindful that there may be questions about her case that may not be able to be answered right now. So with that, I will pass the time over to Dr. Aldosari.
Thank you, Danaka. Thank you for CODEPINK for having us for this discussion. I know there is a lot of mixed messages out there about the guardianship system and the reforms that took place recently to remedy some of the issues or some of the restrictions women faced under the system. But just to start with giving a little bit of some of the context to the issue of guardianship and the sponsorship system or the Kafala system, I'm gonna give you a bit of a reading on the situation for women in general in Saudi Arabia and in the region. Starting with sharing a screen here. Hold on. All right. So basically, the problem of women's rights in the Middle East and North Africa has been a persistent and measured and documented problem for so many decades. Actually, in the UN Development Program, the Human Development Program of 2002, three main factors contributed to the problems in basically ensuing any type of development, more so for women. These were the lack of political freedom, the problem in accessing information, and women's rights in general. Basically, because those governments are not accountable governance, there is no representation, real representation of women. Women were excluded from historically from the workforce, from leadership positions, from positions of influence. And this has, of course, been exacerbated in the last few years because of problems of the conflict in the region, because of the forced displacement, aggressive policies in the region, of course, initiated by one part of it was Saudi Arabia government in Yemen and the Syrian civil war and the revolutions that very much like became political side, basically politicized largely in those countries in Syria, Iraq, Libya, and other places. And of course, the military empowerment and involvement in certain countries like Egypt. So all of those issues, coupled with the austerity measures enforced by those governments, because of the lack of equitable spending and the financial consideration to women or to those who are mostly affected by those conditions, have exacerbated the situation for women. If we look at the differences between men and women in four main domains, the economic participation and opportunity, the educational attainment, health and survival, and political empowerment, you will find that the Middle East and North Africa is one of the lowest places where women are actually largely discriminated against in two main areas in political empowerment and economic participation and access to opportunities. This has been persistent since the year that those types of measures started to be recorded. So this is one of the most recent one, and still, despite the reforms that took place, women are lagging behind men in ability to access economic opportunities and in political empowerment. This has also been reflected in the prevalence of violence against women, in particular the domestic violence, which is one of the most prevalent problems facing women worldwide, that 1 in 3 women are affected by it, but more so women in places where they are not represented, where there are restrictions to women to organize themselves and lobby their governments for resources or have resources on their own, like the Middle East and North Africa, you'll see that it has one of the highest prevalence of intimate partner violence or sexual violence. There are also the indicators of gender gap of Saudi Arabia in 2020. Saudi Arabia has been one of the countries that persistently ranked lowest despite any kinds of reforms that took place, despite the fact that women in Saudi Arabia outnumber men in graduation or educational attainment or graduation from university, because that is not reflected in a real empowerment where women are able to influence and challenge the governments for better and meaningful representation. So as I said, the main two areas where women are lagging behind and causing women to be discriminated against largely are the political and economic participation. And Saudi Arabia has been very active in assigning women into certain leadership positions, and especially positions where Saudi Arabia country is represented abroad as part of the economic vision to 2030 or as part of introducing the new leadership in Saudi Arabia. We've seen women are part now of the advisory council or the shura. They have some certain licenses to run certain charities, but these are all elite women and privileged women who might not be appointed necessarily to change the status quo of women, but more to basically support the status quo and provide this kind of legitimacy for the new regime in Saudi Arabia. Again, there are resistant barriers for women in the workforce, as we're going to see now in discussion of the guardianship system. Just a bit of a history of Saudi Arabia. As you can see, Saudi Arabia is one of the largest countries in the Middle East, established about 90 years ago on a pact between the founding monarch, King Abdulaziz Al Saud, and a religious cleric, Muhammad Abdul Wahab, and this is why the Islamic version or Islamic strain of Saudi Arabia used to be practiced in Saudi Arabia is called Wahhabism, in reference to that cleric who had followed, endorsed and enforced inside Saudi Arabia and abroad a very strict and rigid form of Islam. Women are affected by it until today. And this form of Islam trace back to one of the least popular school of thoughts of Islam, which is the Hanbali school of thought. Its population is about 33 million. A third of those population are migrant workers or people residing in Saudi Arabia from non-Saudis. Women represent about 49% of the population of Saudi Arabia. The economy has been largely dependent on oil revenues. Several governments in the past, over the last few decades, have tried to push for diversification for different types of economy, but there was no political will, a real political will to engage the Saudis in the workforce to change the status quo, to change the means by which the economy has been structured. Basically, it was a rentier state where the more people are on the public spending, the more the monarchy felt at ease, and there is no challenges to the stability of the ruling family. But that has been transformed in the last decades. First, initially it was transformed because of the pan-Arab nationalism, which fueled, that happened, of course, in the revolution in the 50s and 60s, that fueled more and more religious attachment and the religious endorsement and enforcement of the government inside Saudi Arabia. There has been a movement inside Saudi Arabia called the Sahwa or Awakening, in which modernization had to be approached carefully in ways that protected the Islamic identity of the state. Again, mostly women were the most affected group. Women and the minorities were the most affected group because the courts were manned by religious clerics. The deans of universities had to observe those kinds of teachings. Workforce has been established and structured for gender segregation and other issues that we're going to talk about. There were people who were calling for reduced power of the monarchs or the monarchy and more power to people so that they can represent their needs better. These were called the constitutional reformists. That had happened during the 90s, during the invasion of Iraq. But unfortunately, none of these were able to push for real reforms. Then comes the 9/11 and the rise of the political Islam and militant Islam. that brought so much scrutiny to Saudi Arabia leadership and their role in fueling those kinds of movements. And we witnessed after that several reforms that took place. Recently, and since 2011, which is the last decade basically, there has been an active movement from the leadership in Saudi Arabia, UAE, and the other monarchies in the region to push back against the mass revolutions of 2010 in what is called now the counter revolutions, and to introduce economic reforms in ways to address the youth bulge and the threat to their own rule, basically. So to speak about the guardianship system, this is a patriarchal traditional societies in Saudi Arabia that has been indoctrinated for decades, according, as I said, to a most austere form of Islam that really mandated gender segregation in most of the public places and education, and channeled women into caregiving roles, whether in the family, the priority we're giving to women's role as a wife and as a mother, and also in the workforce. So they were teachers, women were actively, educated to be teachers, to be in the social services and healthcare, or less and less women in STEM, for instance, education. And that caused an underdeveloped and less enforced laws and legislation, because as I said, the court system has been based on religious interpretation of ancient Sharia rule, and that hasn't been codified into laws that really respond to changes in women roles or changes in the lifestyle. It is still very much like police enforcement and the law enforcement, the police, the court system is largely underdeveloped. And if there were any laws, like for instance, the protection from violence law that has been introduced in 2013, it's weakly enforced because of the patriarchal culture of the first responders, whether in the social services or other places. Education and work opportunities have been very much like restricted to certain issues, as I said. The work has been changed, of course, since the 2014, and I will explain more later. There was public engagement also, so women themselves were not really passive in this kind of dynamics. Women organized themselves since the 1992, challenged the restriction on mobility, for instance, to drive their cars against a women driving ban. Afterwards, to engage women in municipal election councils, they were not allowed to be appointed or to be part of it. Afterwards, for protection of violence, women were writers in the 2000s. They were all writers. And comes in the 2019, and women moved online more and more to demand more of accountability and dismantling the male guardianship system. Young women had different aspirations because they come from a generation where it's easily, they can easily access information, they can easily get connected online, despite the restrictions enforced in real life. And because of that, they were the most visible women. They were able to achieve more of a campaigns that interacted with wider groups of, of women and men. They were able to reach beyond their own country, basically. And this was one of the opportunities and the challenge. Because of that, they were not allowed to have any voice or influence. This online communities, this online access to online information and connectivity were very much cut short by what the government decided to declare as a betrayal. Those women were very much like rounded up. They were charged with treason. They were publicly smeared. And of course, many of them remain in prison to date since 2018. We'll talk a little bit more later. But basically, during the Saudi state history, we had areas where some reforms involving women were introduced. As I said, after the 9/11 attack, there was some kinds of scrutiny, international scrutiny, that led to King Abdullah offering in 2005 scholarships for men and women. Only women had to be accompanied by a male guardian or by someone, a male relative, during the duration of her study abroad. That was least enforced later on. For instance, myself, I was on a scholarship and my father couldn't be with me all the time, but he had to come and sign the paperwork here in the US. But then afterwards, I was staying and studying on my own. The government enacted legislation to establish a dialogue and human rights institution that report to the royal court, so they were not independent, but they were able to engage with the global human rights community and at least to have certain overseeing power over the violations that took place within. So business women had a better luck since they were coming mostly from elite families, from families related to the monarchy in one way or the other. So they were able to access certain reforms prior to any other women. They were able to be part of their own chambers of commerce. They were able to stay in hotels, to rent rooms in hotels where other Saudi women were not able to. There were also more visibility for women writers and women engagement and delegates and delegations that represented Saudi Arabia abroad. After the Arab uprising, the king issued a certain set of reforms, including engaging women in the advisory council, to the Royal Advisory Council, which is called Shura, allowing women to run for some seats in the municipal councils, and allowing women to work in gender mixed areas or spaces in the service sector. And this is where we saw the highest engagement of women in the workforce. And since the decision was made, more women joined the workforce than ever before. We had 500,000 women joining the service sector, which is the retail sector, basically. And then in 2014, with the advent of reduction in the oil prices that affected all the monarchies in the region, the government decided to create certain economic reforms and introduced Vision 2030, which is mainly an economic diversification plan. The Guardianship campaign that came in 2016, but of course it was called for by the women writings, by meetings, by human rights organization before that. But it turned into a campaign, as I said, because women were able to connect with each other online and to organize themselves better. And this came on the aftermath of October 26 driving campaign, in which women used the same methods that they've used to garner attention, to influence their communities, and to get solidarity from international human rights organization. So the Guardianship campaign called for certain actionable reforms to take place, which are the ability for women to have a say in her marriage, divorce, and to have an equal authority over her children, whether it's within marriage or after divorce. Ability for women to travel and obtain identification number passports without the permission of a male guardian, to obtain any type of health services needed, because hospitalization, for instance, admission, required women to get a consent from her male guardian. Access to a life-saving abortion if her life is affected because of a pregnancy, she needed the consent, or not only the abortion, but also to procedures that might affect her fertility. She needed a male guardian permission for it. To be able to work in all fields without restrictions, which is taking place now. Now there is almost no restrictions for women working in any field. Access to educational and training opportunities. As I said, certain professions, for instance, the highest ranking university, which is the Petroleum University in Saudi Arabia, were not allowed, women were not allowed to be students there, but now they're allowing their first ever graduate class of women to enroll in the university. They also asked for women to be able to exit from shelters, prisons, or university campuses or housings without the permission from a guardian, and this is not happening. This didn't happen. They also asked for the government to abolish the cases of disobedience and absence from home, which were frequently raised against women who challenged their guardian's authority. If I decided to go for work in a different country, in a different city, and live in a different residence from my guardian against his wishes, he could easily put me in prison on the basis of disobedience or absence from home. If I decided to travel, although it's now allowed, if I decided to travel, that also will cause me to be subjected to disobedience. The campaign also asked for women to be able to commute, drive without the consent of a guardian, and for women to be protected from violence, which remains a huge challenge for women. As I said, the reforms were very much limited. It only affected obtaining your travel document, your identification document without a guardian. You're able to drive, you're able to travel, you're able to work in different places. The king introduced also an anti-sexual harassment and anti-discrimination law at work so that women and men can get the same pay for the exact job. So the police, the religious police, which used to roam the street to basically detain people or observe how people are dressed, especially women, they are now only working online. So they're very much like under i'tidal or under a center that is created by the royal court to monitor Saudis activities online. But we still do get cases now, until the last month, where women who are not wearing the traditional dress code are disappearing after, posting a video of themselves being stopped from entering public places. As I said, women were also allowed to obtain or appointed to certain leadership positions as a first spokesperson, for instance, or a first woman ambassador in the US. But their representation remains symbolic and it's not substantive, and they didn't really affect or we didn't see them yet affect any changes in the treatment of women at large. There was also an increase in women workforce. So the plan aimed for an 8% increase by 2020. COVID-19, of course, has affected the whole plan, and many women now are unemployed. And most of the women now are able to attend public places for entertainment event, for any sport event that wasn't there before, mostly without restrictions. But that happened, this kind of reform happened hand in hand with a wave of arrests for most of the women activists and the smear campaign. For instance, the Vogue Arabia cover page that was launched specifically when women driving ban was lifted, showed Haifa bint Abdullah, which is the daughter of the last king, as the symbol for driving force with Saudi Arabia women, which is something that, of course, we've never heard of her name before. And while those women activists were posted, their photos were posted online and the state-owned media, with basically a label that they were traitors. And they were, of course, most of them were subjected to detention in unknown facilities, torture, very vicious torture, sexual harassment, and abuse. Some of them were released pending trials, so they cannot really travel, they cannot resume their work. Many of them were working in universities, so they're actually suspended from their work. And those who remain in prison are subjected to very much like harassment, legal harassment. They're unable. I'm sure some of you know what's happening to al-Hathloul, who is one of the most prominent women activists. She is now entering her third year in prison. She undergoes duration where visitation isn't allowed, as well as communication with her family. At the same time, the government is pushing those kinds of messaging online and in social media, depicting feminism as a radical thought. And this is something that is with the sponsorship of the State Security Department that reports to the Royal Court. And they are describing it as unpatriotic affiliation. So moving forward, I don't want to take a lot of time. Moving forward, because I get a lot of questions on how can we move forward when there's a huge surveillance inside Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is turning into more restrictive police state. Again, what the report of 2002 has mentioned, the access to information and to knowledge in a police state remains a challenge. So any movement that would be working to provide the information, to push back against the propaganda, against the misinformation, especially now online, this is a big challenge, is a movement that is moving in the right direction. We have a Saudi Al-Udma. This is a podcast that Amnesty is sponsoring. I participate in the podcast with other Saudi activists, whereby I just finished presenting a season in Arabic about feminism and the important work of the women activists in moving forward and in implementing real and meaningful reforms. Musawa is an organization made by scholars, Muslim women scholars, who are pushing for a reinterpretation of or a new reading of Islamic thoughts that would grant women equality in the family law. And of course, political parties that are now people in diaspora, Saudis in diaspora, are trying to form political parties in order to push for democratic representation. And of course, any collective action would help in building the capacity, as the work that we're seeing now. If there are several people working on issues involving reforms in Saudi Arabia, it helps a lot to have a collective action, or to put the Saudis, or put basically the community figures in those types of plans, or in those types of actions for more successful and sustainable movement. So I'll stop here and move to Bethany, I think, on the sponsorship system.
Thank you so much, Dr. Aldosari. I see a question in the chat, so we will come to that after Bethany gives her presentation. Sure. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Bethany.
All right. Thank you. And just want to say thank you, first of all, for having me here. And honestly, it's an honor to be with Dr. Hala Aldosari on the panel. She's just an incredible academic and scholar, and has been an amazing human being overall. And so thank you so much for your work. And also just grateful to CODEPINK, to Freedom Forward and the Freedom Initiative for putting this event together, and for continuing to work for justice in Saudi Arabia and taking a stand for women and children globally. And I'll just say that I'm really grateful to be here in general, back in the States, free and able to speak on this without risking my life here. And it's taken me a while to speak on my own experience and my own situation in Saudi Arabia, because it is so fresh and still quite triggering. But I am free to speak now, and I did leave behind several women that I met in the courts and in my human rights research there, who are in horrific ongoing situations of abuse, neglect, wrongful imprisonment, and not many of us are able to see it firsthand and get out, and especially from my angle and being a US citizen and my experience, to be able to take this back is it's an honor. So I've seen too much to stay silent on this. And for nearly 2 years, my daughter and I were stuck in Saudi Arabia because of these two systems of oppression. The male guardianship system trapped my daughter, and it was the Kafala system that for a time trapped me. So these systems do trigger into so much more abuse that happens. And I think before I go forward, it's really important for me to establish something before continuing in this discussion, especially with my background. Unfortunately, Saudi Arabia triggers unwarranted, hateful, and discriminatory or Islamophobic rhetoric sometimes. And I want it to be extremely clear going forward that Saudi Arabia is an absolute monarchy, like Hala has already said, and the people are not free or represented. So they are incredibly diverse, and there's wonderful. However, Saudis literally risk their lives if they criticize or diverge from the government propagated narrative, which is why we've seen several human rights activists or even people who've criticized in very small ways be arbitrarily detained or enforcibly disappeared. So I want it to be clear, as I criticize Saudi, I am saying the Saudi government and not the people. And I criticize it because I want to see it become better and live up to the potential that there is. And obviously I want a better Saudi for my own daughter. And if we are not honest about some of these issues, it will continue to damage several generations of women and children. And the second point that I think is really important to reiterate in the interest of avoiding Islamophobic rhetoric is that it is not Sharia law or Islamic law here that we're talking about. Countless diverse interpretations of Islamic law exist, as Dr. Hala Aldosari has already covered. Some of those interpretations uphold and protect principles of human rights laws, and others don't. However, Saudi Arabia does have one of the strictest and most rigid and most politically motivated forms and interpretations of Islamic law that's held by any recognized nation state in the world. So when we're speaking of the Kafala system or the sponsorship system and the male guardianship system, it's important that you understand these as Saudi government systems and not necessarily to confuse them as part and parcel with Islamic law. So with the clear distinction there, I'll kind of continue to go on a bit on my story. So as I mentioned, being held in Saudi Arabia with my daughter, and initially I was stripped of custody for being too Western in Saudi courts. And then I was later forced by the government, the Human Rights Commission and others, the Saudi government, to settle with my abuser. I remember reading the comments in the first New York Times story that came out on our case. And a lot of people were asking, well, they have US passports, why don't they just leave? Or why doesn't she go to the US embassy to get her out? Or she has a PhD in international law, didn't she know better? So I do understand a lot of the confusion, so I do want to explain here. First, Saudi Arabia has arguably one of the most restrictive exit and entry procedures for residents in the world. You have to exit the country also for Saudi citizens with a fingerprint. And it's connected to your Saudi ID or your Saudi residence ID number. And within the system, you will have to have, as a foreigner, a permission from your sponsor or your kafil, who's either your employer or your husband, if you're a foreigner and married to somebody who's a Saudi citizen or somebody who's employed in the kingdom. And they have to register that permission to exit or re-enter the country. They can revoke it at any time without you being aware. And the same is true for females that are born to Saudi men. Obviously, since Saudi women cannot pass on citizenship, the issue is very different for children of Saudi women than it is for children of Saudi men. But the children of Saudi men come under male guardianship indefinitely at birth. So you can't just exit the country with a passport. I couldn't use my daughter's US passport. It doesn't work like that. Doesn't matter if they have a foreign passport, if their father is a Saudi citizen, he'll be involved in the process of granting them to exit. So I moved to Saudi Arabia after living in Tunisia and witnessing the Arab Spring. And I started doing my research for my master's dissertation in Middle East and Islamic law. And I was studying some of the uprisings that were happening in Saudi Arabia in the Eastern province and studying discriminations against the Shiite minority. And at that time, you could not get a tourist visa. You couldn't obtain a tourist visa until 2019 to get into Saudi Arabia. So I had to get a job teaching at a university and conducted my illegal human rights research on the side in my own time. That was the only way to access the country. So I did meet while I was in Saudi Arabia and fell in love with my ex-husband while I was in Riyadh. He was progressive. He was an atheist. He was against the Saudi government. He seemed very charming. And we were planning on immigrating to the United States. That was his dream. He'd gotten his MBA in Denver, and he was very, very obsessed with America. So I was aware of the risks. But I trusted and loved this person. And there will be several women who have been in abusive relationships that will understand that abusers are often some of the most charming, successful people in the public eye. The difference in this situation is because Saudi law does not protect women or children from abuse, nor does it offer any form for legal recourse for abusers. There's hardly any accountability, as Dr. Aldosari has said. We often find that the Kafala system and male guardianship systems are actually systems of enabling abuse to continue with impunity. And we can see that they're also used to retaliate against women in their lives by exercising control and by intimidating women. In 2013, there was a highly publicized international case of a 5-year-old girl who was sexually assaulted and murdered. Her name was Lema by her father. In the end, when that case went to appeal, the father was actually dropped of all charges and was let go and released. And instead of being charged with murder and the rape of his 5-year-old daughter, he was able to argue on appeal that because he took her to the hospital, he didn't technically kill her. So he was let go and charged with excessive discipline of a child. So while Saudi Arabia does report, and the Saudi Human Rights Commission has reported to the Committee for Ending Discrimination Against Women, has reported that there are no known honor killings in Saudi Arabia, we find that it happens very often and frequently, and because there's no form of accountability or data being created on that, it falls underneath the radar. But it's incredibly common that women will disappear, be killed by their partners, or their parents, or their male guardian, and there's not much that is done. Several men there's been cases where they've burnt to death their wives, and the court would sentence maybe to 8 months or 9 months in prison, and then they walk free. So to explain the Kafala system a bit and how it does enable that, in Saudi Arabia, every foreign resident is required to be legally registered under their sponsor. And the sponsor exercises significant ownership over their life. And in the case of a marriage to a Saudi citizen or resident, a foreign wife will be under their husband's sponsorship. That means that you would require the husband's approval to exit or enter the country. The husband is required to maintain your legal status. If he refuses to renew your legal status, you become illegal. He could deport you. He could make it so that you can't access bank accounts. He could refuse to get you access to healthcare. And you require still for people under sponsorship, though it's changed for the male guardianship system because Saudi women have done such a fantastic job advocating for that, many of whom are in prison right now. But at any rate, that remains for foreign women who are married to Saudis. They still have the same exact restrictions, those archaic restrictions that Saudi women have had from the beginning and fought to get certain rights for. So again, when you are married to a Saudi citizen or a man who's working in Saudi Arabia, you become his dependent under his sponsorship. If you left the house without his permission, it still remains that you could be registered as a runaway, and again, subject to arrest or deportation at any time. So under Kafala's system, the employer, the husband, exercises extreme control and ability to abuse without much option for legal recourse. In 2019, the Department of State, the United States Department of State published that the Kafala system exasperates human rights violations and it exasperates human trafficking risks, and that individuals who are under sponsorship were unable to exercise their right to remove themselves from dangerous situations. And this was the case for me, and it's been the case for so many women living in hellish realities on the ground in Saudi. Now, we've talked a bit about male guardianship on the ground for Saudi women and children, but I do think that what's missing here is understanding it within the global context with children and how it contributes to the facilitation of kidnapping of children from all around the world to Saudi Arabia by their fathers with impunity, with no form of legal recourse for that. So Hala did cover that incredibly well, and that unfortunately, because at birth, men are considered the automatic legal guardian, when a father takes their child, for example, from the United States, if they're even only US citizens, once on the ground in Saudi Arabia, as the male guardian, that's not considered a kidnapping case, and there's no form of accountability for the mothers except for leaving the country that they and their child were living in to try to take up residency in Saudi Arabia and file a case there, where they are extremely disadvantaged in the courts. Another thing to note in this situation is that Saudi embassies and consulates have been involved in these cases where US citizens who have been born, children who've been born here to US citizens and Saudi fathers, because of male guardianship not requiring women's permissions to issue documents of Saudi children, they're able to go to the consulate without the mother's permission, issue temporary travel documents for US citizens, and take them out of states in the United States back to Saudi Arabia, even with active court orders stating that they're not allowed to leave a state Pennsylvania, for example, there was a case out of Pennsylvania a couple years ago where 3 children were kidnapped, and the consulate had facilitated an emergency travel document for that with an active court order against that happening. So it should be understood that this impacts negatively Saudi women, but it also impacts thousands and thousands of children who are born to Saudi fathers all over the world, and in any country at any time. And that will always be a risk of anyone who's had a child with a Saudi citizen, is that they may lose their child at any moment if the father is able to get that child to a Saudi consulate. There will always be a risk. So I'll also just say that in my own situation, it took a lot of fighting for me to be able to get home. And of course, that is a fear that I live with, but I'm doing everything that I can now. I got back in December of 2019. And as I said, I was forced by the Saudi government to settle with my abuser, and I was robbed of due process, according to even Saudi legal procedures in Riyadh. They left me to fend for myself, and it was only by allowing myself to be sexually violated by my ex-husband and pretending to love him that I was able to get back home to the US with my daughter. So when I came back, I filed for emergency jurisdiction in Washington State, and the UN also filed a complaint on my behalf. A court in Washington State is currently protecting my daughter and I, holding jurisdiction until we get a final ruling. And I'm fighting to stay with her. But since I returned, countless women started reaching out to me asking how I had gotten out. And the numbers have started growing. So since February of 2020, I've alone documented and been contacted regarding 43 cases of US citizens alone. There's also been women from Saudi, from Kenya, from the Philippines, from Ireland, from England, from Somalia, from all over the world that are suffering. But I wanted it to be clear that also there's currently 43 US citizen women and children that have either been kidnapped or that are stuck there under Kafala or male guardianship system in situations of abuse and neglect and being discriminated against in courts and suffering. And they've been cases from Washington State, Florida, Utah, Michigan, Virginia, California, New York, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Texas. So for a lot of us, it's a lot closer than you think and realize. And this is such a short period of time. So they're staying silent. And some of the cases we've been advocating with their representatives and with Senate and working on some actions on behalf of these women. And I would also like to ask you guys, if you are US citizens or residents, to reach out to your representatives and to make them aware that you know of these cases and you are aware that this is a problem that needs to be solved, calling for an end to the Kafala and male guardianship systems, which are entrapping and damaging so many people, and for justice for all of the women rights activists that have fought for these rights to be released from prison as well. So I think I'll let you take it away, Danaka, for some questions and follow up.
Thank you so much, Bethany. So yeah, for now we'll move on to questions. And CODEPINK actually has an action page up right now where there's a letter drafted. It'll automatically send it to your representatives if you fill it out. I will post that link in the chat for anyone who is tuning in if they want to fill that out while someone is answering one of the questions. So the first question we have is, this one was for Dr. Aldosari, I think. This came up during your presentation. Do you expect any progress under the authority of MBS in Saudi Arabia?
Well, the main progress only happens when decision-making is informed by the needs of people, right? And how can you inform decision-making if the people are unable to speak out? For instance, I'm astonished that for decades, women from powerful countries, like democratic countries like the US and Europe, in Canada, we have actually a case of Canadian woman who has been trapped with her kids with an abusive Saudi husband. For decades, women have tried to raise those issues, but either they were silenced, repressed, they were banned from travel, they were the women activists, I'm saying, or the community of activists who are working around those issues. They are not able to address those issues properly. And despite the small margin that we used to have before King Salman, before MBS, we were able, for instance, I was able to engage with members of the Human Rights Commission, which are, reporting to the royal court, or very much like governmental. They don't have a representation from people, but there were people, Saudi people on board, who were very helpful. We were able, for instance, to negotiate an employer, to get a domestic worker from Nigeria out of the country because he was against, cutting her contract short and sending her to her father. So the churches in the US actually contacted me and said, we needed help for this woman. And I was able to contact someone in the Human Rights Commission. And there was this kind of mutual trust at the beginning. We didn't have, yes, we didn't have a freedom to form organizations or to establish more of an organized work, but we had an informal connection to people who can negotiate on our behalf or on the behalf of those domestic workers or women in distress in general. So he was able to talk to her employer to project some kind of authority as someone who works in a formal organization, and ask him to let this woman go because under the Saudi laws, as Bethany mentioned, she is under the mercy of her employer. He could actually say, I'm not going to let her out until she finishes her contract, regardless of her situation. And it's very difficult for women even to access the legal system, to go to court. She was in a remote place where restrictions are very much like, and I said again, the first responders, the people who are working in law enforcement and hospitals are very much like unempowered. Either they were unempowered or they don't have the power to enforce the legislation. They are afraid from retaliation from those abusers who are usually well connected in the community. And most of those working in the health system are foreign doctors or nurses. Or they feel like this is a private matter. They themselves have been part of this patriarchal culture. This is a private matter. I shouldn't interfere. The women should negotiate within her family or extended family a way to resolve her conflicts. And they don't feel that they have enough preparedness or enough awareness or support from the system to engage or to intervene. So yes, MBS, the one thing that MBS did to this budding community of activists and people, concerned citizens trying to resolve this issue and to move those, to move reforms in those issues ahead, is to kill it in the bud. So he went against, I'm sure most of you have heard about al-Hathloul, about prominent men and women inside Saudi Arabia, clerics who were calling for a more progressive looks into Islam, more reinterpretation of religion, who have actually supported the women movement, are facing the death penalty now. Not because of what they did, it's because of their influence that competes with MBS's voice. And this is the problem. As long as MBS is holding those people in prison, it sends a shocking wave of, silence. And everyone who's observing this situation, if women are watching their fellow citizens, being imprisoned for doing this type of advocacy or activism, of course, there is no information being gathered, there is no awareness being spread, and there is no pressure against the MBS or the government to enact any reform.
Thank you so much. This question is from the YouTube stream. What changes do you think are needed to make women's reforms authentic? This can go to either of you.
Yeah, I think exactly what Bethany said. Bethany said that despite the fact that reforms have been done to the laws and regulations, in practice, she couldn't find any support. So I think the meaningful reform should really involve women, should be the transparency. What's happening on the ground should be discussed openly. And women who are able to voice their concerns, whether they are the subject of abuse or subject of the legal discrimination, or women activists. So without a thriving, transparent, open civil society, I don't think any meaningful reform will take place, despite the fact that there were some reforms that took place now, but they didn't benefit the women who are mostly marginalized or oppressed. Bethany, if you want to add something about that.
The only thing that I would add, and I completely agree with her, is that for every reform that's announced, there's a loophole that manages to get men out of it. So what we find is on the ground in practice, for example, we said that in some circumstances, women can pass on citizenship, Saudi women can pass on citizenship, but you'll find that it's left in the hands of the person deciding to either choose to implement or not, and they can use the legal loophole or not. We even have cases as of 2 weeks ago of women who aren't being allowed to exit, even though they hold custody, hold Saudi citizenship with their own children. And there's mixed messages that are coming from the government agencies. So I think meaningful reform will mean that we see that political prisoners are not being taken, they're being released, that dialogue is happening, that the people are represented, and that the legal system has changed. Currently, judges are all males. There's no option for a civil court. It has to, even if you're a non-Muslim, you're subject to a very strict interpretation of Sharia law. Even the neighbors, Iran has an option for different interpretations to happen and for a codified personal status. Saudi Arabia does not have codified personal status law. So while these reforms are announced, the loopholes need to be gone. There needs to be clear implementation across the board, no way to wiggle out of it, and obviously accountability. So when people don't follow the rules, there needs to be accountability for people in power positions, and there currently isn't. So it's still just a mess. And I mean, we were talking about some of the reforms on dress code, talking about travel bans, talking about feminism in Dr. Hala's case. It's not just impacting Saudi citizens. In 2019, I had a 10-year travel ban placed on me without due process, without a trial, without a chance to even be notified or served. In 2019, in my court case, feminism was used against a family member that was defending and testifying on behalf of myself and my daughter in the court case to silence her. And because she was female, her testimony wasn't considered, saying that my daughter should stay with me and not be placed in an abusive household. And this is one of the family members of my ex and my ex-husband. And then also the dress code, like there's been announced there's reforms, but in 2019 I was detained for a public violation of decency laws. And it just depends on who files complaints. And there's inconsistency and loopholes, and it's still a matter of who's connected to who. And in a man's world, who's connected to who is always a man on top. So we lose in the end.
This is an interesting question. Can Saudi business women employ men, and have authority over them under the Kafala system?
Yes. But with limitations to that, right? So I owned a business in Saudi Arabia as well. And I'll just say that it is not as easy as they make it out to be. And the reality for, like Dr. Hala said, the reality for Saudi citizens is different than the reality for foreigners. And just a word of advice to people thinking as foreign investors to invest in Saudi Arabia: do not do it. You are at risk as long as there is not freedom of speech. I had a court case for my business filed against me saying I was against the government, and that can destroy a business. So it's not a stable environment to invest in. I left behind everything, my home, my business, but freedom's better than that. So yeah, there's limitations, but just a side note, don't invest in Saudi Arabia. Thanks.
I know Qatar just effectively got rid of their kafala system. And while I sift through these questions, we'll take a couple more. What do you think the impact of a neighboring country abolishing their kafala system has on Saudi Arabia's system?
I think it's important. I think we live in a very much like well-connected world, and what happens, especially with countries with similar societal structure or economic structure, it also present a counter argument for why we can't change. If one of those governments, if one of the neighboring governments are able to affect a positive reform and to enact positive reform, then the argument is very much like lost on Saudi Arabia. If Qatar, which Qatar is a bit different than Saudi, basically because they were the majority of the population very much like are foreigners, in contrast with the Saudis, 2/3 are Saudis. But in the Qataris case, I think the fact that they are able to reform the system, and of course, again, reform in those countries are very much problematic. Why? Because we don't have transparency, we don't have monitoring of how reforms are implemented, which makes it very difficult for us to judge how effective is the reform. And because the system of the sponsorship is linked to many aspects of a worker's life. So yes, it can enable him to change. For instance, there were some reforms to the Kafala system in Saudi. In theory, you can actually move from one employment to the next under a different sponsor if your sponsor approves it. But in reality, that has been very challenging for many workers, and the restriction on movement again. So it remains basically to be seen if Qatar has actually implemented the reform in ways that is responsive to the needs of the people, and allowed independent entities, whether from their citizens or outside, to examine those types of reforms, because it can be reformed on paper, but not in reality.
Just to add to that, there was an initiative that was taken by the United States to pressure for some in the past. And in 2013, there was the introduction of the mother's residency status that was for divorced mothers of Saudi citizens. And this is the only iqama or residency that currently exists in Saudi Arabia where you're listed as your own sponsor. So eventually, when my situation was resolved, I went under that sponsorship. And when you're under that system, you're able to exit yourself, and you control your own exit visa procedures, etc. However, if you remarry, you lose that status. So what happens is there's a window of time where women are allowed to access that. However, it is also in practice really hard for women to get, and that happened to me. It requires the ex-husband to give documentation that women would normally not have in Saudi Arabia, among other things. But it's definitely possible. So it would not be difficult for Saudi Arabia to either give that status to everyone. So essentially, everybody's their own sponsor and can exit or re-enter as they choose. Then that essentially is eliminated. But for some reason, that pressure stopped after that, and it needs to continue now, because at present, the only sort of reform that will work is people having agency over whether they can exit and re-enter and have control over their own lives. So it's definitely a possibility. And I think that with pressure from the US and from Congress, that can help and actually happen.
So this question is asking, is resistance from Saudi Arabia to change these systems, is that more of a, this is how it's always been kind of attitude, or do you think it's more viewed as resistance to foreign intervention or meddling in Saudi law or policies?
Yeah, as I've mentioned, the triggers for reform, as I've noted, of course, this is the political system is way too closed in Saudi Arabia to understand how decision is being debated, or how there is some kind of a deliberation of any decision before it's decided on. So because of that, because we have an absolute monarchy, it's very difficult to judge what works and what doesn't, because there is no transparency. But monitoring, as I've mentioned in my talk, the triggers for reform, it seems to be linked to how legitimate the system wants to seem. So for instance, MBS, a newcomer, someone who might not be well known by international allies or regional allies will have some kind of reforms. This because most of the authoritarian leaders tend to use women's rights as a way to show that the regime is flexible, that the new leader is more in tune with the allies' values and the global values, that he's more worthy of trust, basically. But it is not necessarily aimed towards achieving gender equality, as we've seen in Saudi Arabia, where women are able to have more accessibility to public spaces, to entertainment, to attend events. There were also a law that regulates the moral codes, basically. What is the moral code? And again, this is a very vague, very much like undefined code. The only ones who get to define it are the prosecutors. So women who actually believe in those types of opening, who are going out without a certain dress code, for instance, are subjected to punishment and arbitrary detention. So it's very difficult, basically, to understand a system that as closed as Saudi Arabia. But it seems that in times where there is a lot of massive political arrest, like the Arab revolutions, when there is a lot of scrutiny for Saudi Arabia's leadership, like what happened after 9/11, when it's time that a new leader is emerging, basically, or ascending, and they needed to have this kind of legitimacy. When the regime is challenged by those issues, there are certain concessions being made, but I don't see the full reforms taking place without representation of people, without people being able to challenge and question and hold their governments accountable.
Okay, thank you. We'll take one more question. Where was that one? I think it was about bank accounts. Can women hold bank accounts in Saudi Arabia without a guardian's permission?
Yes, they can. And again, in theory, you don't have to have a guardian permission, but in reality, if your guardian is restricting your access to work, if he's restricting your exit from home, it is very difficult for you to have an access to a bank account. And many women who had bank accounts are coerced in homes. There is also a form of financial or economic violence, where even when she has access to her accounts, and this happened to so many women inside Saudi Arabia who have put their money into joint ownership of a house along with their husbands, but the house is registered under his name. It's very difficult in court to argue that the money goes, the money that went to the house is partly her money, especially when she decided to get a divorce or to leave her husband. So she's not accounted, or her husband dies, for instance, she doesn't inherit the full rights that she's supposed to have. So yeah, it's in theory you don't need that, but again, we talk again about the loopholes that Bethany has mentioned. About the ways the men can control women's access to those rights or ability to challenge the authority of the guardian in courts.
And I'll just add to that for under Kafala, a dependent of somebody who's working or employed, a wife, a female dependent, does not have the right to have her own bank account without permission. So it's different.
Okay. I always like to end these kind of things with the question about, and Bethany mentioned it already, what can we do? What's our responsibility in this issue? And I will say, I think everyone on this webinar should sign up for CODEPINK, Freedom Forward, Freedom Initiative email, so you can know what's up, what's going on. We will be sending out actions. We send out actions every week or so. I highly advise everyone to go on to Freedom Forward, CODEPINK, Freedom Initiative's website, see what we're about, see what we're up to. And with that, I will pass it on to Bethany and Dr. Aldosari for any closing remarks, thoughts, what we can do.
Do you want me to start on the US end or?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, I'll just say, as I mentioned, everybody has rights and a voice in the States. And that's like learning how our system, I've been out of the States since I was 18. So coming back to this and again, having agency and being able to speak to your representatives and then also encourage them to take action. I think it's harder for a lot of people, to understand exactly what is within the realm of possibilities, but especially if you come from one of these states, like if you're from Washington State, you can reference my story. If you're from Virginia, if you're from California, if you're from New York or Massachusetts, Ohio, Texas, Pennsylvania, Florida, Utah, you need to realize that there's people that your senators, should be pressured a bit to take action on this because they have constituents that are currently being severely impacted by this issue. And what I believe is that if Congress takes action and makes a resolution on this and puts some pressure on Saudi Arabia to end the male guardianship system, which they have in the past, but to continue to do that through a relevant lens and to add pressure, and especially to understand more how Kafala system is also an issue that's impacting US citizens and their constituents. So I think especially if you're in those states, taking the time to, like Danaka said, go to the CODEPINK site, and it can set you up to do that. And you just don't realize how powerful the constituents are in getting things to happen. So, and getting your representatives to listen to you. So please do that and then connect with us. And any chance that you get to learn or counter the propaganda narrative that's coming out from Saudi Arabia on reform, always question everything, always research, study, and listen to the voices that are free of Saudi citizens that are able to speak and able to discuss, or people who've experienced Saudi Arabia themselves. And education is a big part of that. So, yeah.
I would just add to that, and these, I think, wonderful actionable step. I just would like to add that the support for the civil society in Saudi Arabia, the support for release of political prisoners, the women activists who have been targeted viciously and tortured without any accountability. I mean, if that happens, if the Saudi government actually is serious about any meaningful reform, those voices should be part and parcel of any changes, of any reforms, of any moving forward to a new Saudi Arabia. And I really urge you to keep on, as Bethany mentioned, to try to lobby, try to support the release of these people, because that would be the real representation of Saudi. Those are the heart and soul, basically, of the figures, the community figures within Saudi Arabia. So I would urge you to support their release, because their release is the real indication of a meaningful reform, especially for women's rights.
Yeah, and I would just say one more thing on the note of not being a part of the propaganda or whitewashing of human rights. There's a lot of events that are coming up right now, the W20, the G20 that are being hosted in Saudi Arabia, the FII event, the women's golf event. A lot of people, even the Backstreet Boys, were performing during the seasons. You had Riyadh season, Jeddah season, which is fantastic for the country to open itself up in certain ways. But at the same time, if these issues aren't being addressed, then it's harming, it's doing more harm. So I would just say that to W20 delegates who are trying to represent Saudi Arabia, it's not fair to participate in things like the G20 when there are people who are in prison, when you're going and competing for $1.5 million from PIF and Aramco in a women's golf tournament, when just a little bit away from you, there's al-Hathloul in prison, there's US citizens, Al-Haidari, there's Badr al-Ibrahim, there's tons of people that are sitting in prison for exercising that freedom. So I would just encourage anybody who's been invited to those to question that. I would encourage them to reconsider their participation in such events until these things and changes have been made, until people have been released, not to be a participant in whitewashing human rights abuses and contributing to the damage and ongoing detainment of people who've only asked for reforms.
I just want
to say one thing. I'm sorry for
that. Go ahead.
Very worthy point that was mentioned by one of the questions, that if outside pressure, if outside calls for reforms is directed to the Saudi government, the people of Saudi Arabia might feel that they're bowing to pressure from, from the outside. But I think what we're seeing is that Saudi Arabia is very open to the world, is very open to art washing, to sport washing, to entertainment. And these people are only coming to Saudi Arabia to take as much money as possible and go. And unfortunately, they're not standing up for values that are considered internationally recognized and important for any kinds of, respectful country. Values of human rights. And I think people in Saudi Arabia do understand that. People in Saudi Arabia do understand that the calls for, the calls to support justice in their own countries are not only local. And we're not asking the world to help Saudi Arabia. We're asking the world to stop emboldening autocratic leaders. And this is different. Not giving them legitimacy, not giving them support where they're not really, deserving. So I think this point has to be very clear that by asking international community, whether they were in academia or in human rights or other places, to be an advocate for real reform, meaningful reform, advocate for women's rights. We are not asking them to basically do our own battle for us. People are in prison, people are in exile and diaspora. But we're asking them to lobby their governments to stop enabling those dictators with arms, with entertainment, with any kinds of money-making, basically, a business that precedes interests for real people.
Thank you so much. Yay, yes. There's a great conversation going on in the chat. I just want to point that out. Thank you for everyone who tuned in. And I want to thank our two panelists today. Thank you so much for making time to be here. I think this is a very, very productive discussion and conversation. I think we learned a lot about what we can do to take action. I will say this is going to be on CODEPINK's YouTube. So if people want to go onto CODEPINK's YouTube and subscribe, it'll be up there as well. If you need to review any of this information. So thank you both so much for being here. Thank you to everyone who tuned in and stayed on. And thank you to our co-sponsors, Freedom Forward and the Freedom Initiative. And I hope everyone has a beautiful weekend.
Thank you.